You're listening to Murder, Not Murdering with Aaron
and Autumn,
a true crime podcast about murder and murdering.
But we are not murderers.
All right, everybody, we are back at Murder, Not Murdering with Aaron and
Autumn.
Autumn's back.
I'm back.
Yay,
And
we're so glad.
It's a good one today. You guys are going to be, probably one of the most famous cases I've ever covered.
That's pretty crazy because you've done a lot of famous cases.
This one's pretty freaking famous.
So one thing I want to tell everybody, though, is that if you can't already tell, I have a cold and I'm not going to subject you to this horrific sounding voice for an entire case. And Autumn has an especially long case, so I'm just going to be reacting to what she has to tell us because, yeah, I don't sound great. I don't feel great. And I don't want to do that for all of you. But next week, I will be back with a full-fledged case with both of us. And that'll be exciting.
With both of us. And a special thank you to Aaron for doing a bunch of solo episodes while I went through technical difficulties, as well as some personal family situations going on. So it was a lot. And she held down the fort for us, for sure. So I'm wanting to return the favor so she can just listen on this episode.
Also, thank you to everybody out there who listened to my solo cases because I know sometimes it's different, it's a different format than what we usually do. So I know it's not the same and it's hard when it's just me all alone and there's no reaction or our banter back and forth. So I appreciate everybody that took the time to listen to my cases. And I am so happy that people liked my Mirage case because it was true crime. But it wasn't a murder. So it was a not murdering case. And I'm so glad people still liked it.
I loved it. I was really into it.
It's definitely one that has always resonated with me. And so I'm really glad that folks reached out and that they also liked it because I was a little nervous going into not only a solo episode, but one that didn't have murder. My next case will, though. Trust and believe.
Trust and believe. Probably some dismemberment.
If only. God. I have to say, though, I have been struggling with research lately, just finding cases that interest me or cases that, not interest me, but that I find interesting. So I'm going to put this out in the universe. If you know of any cases, especially if you listen to our podcast regularly, you know the kind of things that I like. I like old time crimes. I love ones that are interesting, how they solve them, or weird cases. I love all of those, but definitely lean more into the old time crimes. So if you know of any, slide into our DMs on Instagram at Murder Not Murdering because I need some fresh material. I am kind of, going through the same lists. And though I have giant lists of cases to get to, I do. I just, I'm looking for something that sparks my interest right now,
Mm-hmm. No, I totally
I loved
get
the
that.
Murder on the Dance Floor one. That one,
that was really good too.
It was really fun.
It was very interesting. I liked that one.
It was interesting. I liked the Chicago kind of that they literally just lied and she got away with murder, shooting someone in front of hundreds of people and got away with it. So if you haven't listened to that case, do check it out because it's an interesting one. But again, thank you so much for listening to those solo episodes. And it gave Autumn some time to recuperate through grief. And also, her computer was holding her case hostage for quite a while.
It was.
That's the true crime news.
Yes. So you'll understand why I did not want to rewrite it.
Yeah. I'm excited to get into this case. I'm been waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks. There's lots of buildup now, so it better be good.
I better perform.
You better perform.
Yes.
Because you cannot disappoint me at this point.
This is true. She's been very patient.
computer did very much just give her the big middle finger, and it just stopped working. And in that, it also was holding her case hostage inside.
I've learned my lesson, though. Now I send it to my email. I'm not going to lose another case.
Do you know, I do that every time. Just so that it's in a cloud, it's in a network somewhere. I can always get a hold of it, find it, I could access it from other computers, etc.
Usually I never had a worry until this time, but I also didn't have a microphone hookup. So, we did that one episode and man, that was rough for everyone. And I apologize.
Yeah, the call-in.
It was, but
it sounded like a radio call-in in the 90s.
And this
on
case
a radio
is
station.
Far too long to subject everyone to listening to that version. So it was worth the wait.
Yes, I'm so excited. Let's jump right in, Autumn. I can't wait to find out what this uber famous case is that you're doing, because you've done so many famous ones. So I'm really curious.
So this case is titled Darlie Routier, the Mother on Death Row. It's a very famous case. I don't think you know much about it, Erin. So
I sure don't.
Buckle the heck up.
Well, I'm clicked in.
There are some murder cases where the question is simple: who did it? And then there are cases where almost 30 years later, the question is still, what actually happened that night? On June 6th, 1996, 2 little boys were murdered inside their family home in Rolette, Texas. 5-year-old Damon Routier and 6-year-old Devin Routier. Their mother, Darlie Routier, was also seriously injured. She told police that an intruder had entered the house. She said she had been attacked. She said her children had been stabbed. And she called 911. 12 days later, Darlie Routier was arrested. Within a year, she would be convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. And almost 3 decades later, she remains one of the most controversial women on death row in America. Some people look at this case and see an overwhelming collection of evidence against Darlie. Others look at exactly the same evidence and see a deeply flawed investigation that settled on the mother before all of the questions had been answered. And then there are the people somewhere in the middle. People who believe that Darlie may be guilty, but who still question parts of the investigation. Because this isn't just a story about a mother accused of killing her children. It's a story about forensic science. It's about assumptions. It's about the media. It's about what we expect grief to look like. And it's about what happens when a jury is asked to reconstruct a few terrible minutes from blood, fingerprints, fibers, wounds, and a handful of statements made by people who were there. So today, we're going back to the beginning, before the police, before the trial, before the cameras, before the accusations. We're going back to the Routier family. Because if we're going to understand what happened on June 6, 1996, we have to understand who they were before that night. Darlie Lynn Routier was born in 1970. She eventually grew up in Lubbock, Texas. As a young woman, she met Darren Routier. The two eventually married. Together, they built a family and a life that, from the outside, appeared very comfortable. Darren worked in the electronics industry and operated a business. The family eventually moved into a large home in Rolette, a suburb of east of Dallas. And the house itself is important to this story because the layout of the Routier home would become almost as important to the case as the people who lived there. It was a large 2-story house. There was a downstairs family room, a kitchen, a utility room, a garage, and upstairs were the bedrooms. Darlie and Darren had 3 sons. Devin was the oldest. Damon was next, and baby Drake was the youngest. By June of 1996, Drake was only 7 months old. So Darlie wasn't simply raising 3 young children. She was raising a newborn, a 5-year-old, and a 6-year-old. Anyone who's had children knows that alone can make a house feel like controlled chaos.
100%.
There are feedings, laundry, school, meals, baths,
Laundry.
bedtime, laundry,
dishes,
dishes,
never ending.
never. And then just when everyone is finally asleep, the baby wakes up. But from the accounts presented during the investigation and trial, the Routier family also had plenty of happy moments. There were birthdays, family photographs, trips, swimming, and the kind of everyday family life that, in retrospect, becomes heartbreaking. Because when we look at photographs of Devin and Damon now, we know something those photographs obviously didn't know, that their lives were taken far too soon. The Routiers were living what appeared to be an affluent lifestyle. Their home was expensive, they had nice cars, they purchased expensive clothing and other items, and they had accumulated substantial consumer debt. The financial picture would become extremely important later. Prosecutors eventually argued that the Routiers were experiencing serious financial problems and that money was part of Darlie's motive. But here's something important. Being in debt is not the same as being financially desperate. The family had significant obligations, but the evidence presented at trial did not establish that the Routiers were on the verge of losing everything. This distinction matters because the prosecution's theory of motive would become one of the major points of disagreement between the state and the defense. The state would tell the jury that financial pressure was part of the explanation. The defense would argue that prosecutors were taking ordinary family debt and turning it into a motive for murder. And there was another important question. If Darlie had killed her children for money, what money was she actually going to receive?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. I'm like, how does she profit from that?
From young children.
Or from killing any children. How would she profit from that? Insurance? I'm
don't know.
baffled.
There was no simple answer. And the absence of an obvious financial payoff would remain one of the points raised by people who questioned the prosecution's theory. Something else would become incredibly important later. What was Darlie like with her children? People who knew the family gave different descriptions of her personality, but there was no dispute that she was actively involved in her sons' lives. She was a mother to 3 very young boys. She took them places, she celebrated their birthdays, she spent time with them, and she had just gone through the birth of her 3rd child. The period after Drake's birth also became relevant because Darlie experienced depression. This has sometimes been reduced to a single sentence discussion of the case. Darlie had postpartum depression. But that phrase can be misleading if we don't explain what it means. Postpartum depression is a medical condition. It does not automatically mean a mother is dangerous. It does not mean someone is going to hurt her children. And millions of women experience postpartum depression without ever becoming violent. The fact that Darlie's emotional state was discussed during the investigation doesn't, by itself, tell us what happened to Devin and Damon. But prosecutors were interested in her mental and emotional condition because they were trying to construct a motive. And that would become another piece of the picture that they presented to the jury. Now we get to the night everything changed. June 5th, 1996 was a Wednesday. The Routier family was home. Darren had work the following morning. Baby Drake was upstairs, and Devin and Damon were downstairs. The boys had been sleeping in the downstairs family room. Darlie was also downstairs. According to the account she gave investigators, she had fallen asleep on a couch in the family room. Darren was upstairs. The baby was upstairs with him. And sometime during the night, Darlie woke up. What happened next is the central mystery of this entire case. Because from this point forward, there are 2 completely different stories. In one story, an unknown intruder entered the Routier home. The intruder attacked Darlie. The intruder stabbed Devin and Damon. Darlie fought back. The intruder escaped, and Darlie called for help. In the other story, there was no intruder. Prosecutors argued that Darlie killed her sons, injured herself, and staged portions of the scene to make police believe someone had broken into the home. Those two versions of events cannot both be true. And everything that happened afterward would be an attempt to determine which story the evidence supported. The exact sequence of stabbing has never been witnessed by anyone other than the person who committed it. That's important. There was no surviving eyewitness who could tell police, "I saw this person stab those children." Instead, investigators had to reconstruct what happened from physical evidence. Darlie was seriously wounded. Devin and Damon were both stabbed. The weapon was a knife from inside the Routier home. The children were found downstairs. Darren was upstairs with the baby. And eventually, Darlie called 911. That call became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Imagine being the emergency dispatcher receiving a call in the middle of the night. You hear a woman crying. She's saying her children have been stabbed. She says someone broke into her home. She's trying to communicate with the dispatcher while dealing with an unimaginable emergency. Darlie tells the dispatcher that someone came into the house. She says the person stabbed her children. She says the person ran away, and she is trying to get help. At one point, she is asked about the weapon. She says she touched the knife. That detail would later matter. But think about what the situation would actually have looked like. 2 children are bleeding. Darlie is bleeding. Darren has just come downstairs. The baby is upstairs. Paramedics are on the way. This isn't a controlled environment. It's complete chaos. And that matters when we're evaluating statements made during those first few minutes. The prosecution would later identify portions of Darlie's statements that they believed were inconsistent with an innocent victim. The defense would argue that investigators were reading too much into statements made by a woman in the middle of a traumatic emergency. The jury ultimately had to decide which interpretation was more credible. Darren later told investigators that he had been upstairs when he was awakened by Darlie's screams. He came downstairs and he saw the scene. His 2 sons had been attacked. His wife was injured. Darren attempted to help his children while emergency responders were being summoned. And within minutes, police and paramedics began arriving. The scene that confronted them was horrific. Devin and Damon were both critically wounded. Darlie was bleeding from injuries of her own. The house contained blood evidence. A knife was present. And then there were questions about how an attacker could have entered and escaped without leaving the kind of evidence investigators expected to find. But at this moment, police were not yet trying to prove Darlie had killed her children. They were responding to what they initially understood to be a home invasion. 2 children had been attacked, an adult woman had been injured, and someone was supposedly still at large. The boys were transported for emergency treatment, but their injuries were catastrophic. Devin and Damon did not survive. And Darlie was treated for her own injuries. One of those injuries was a deep cut across her neck. The wound would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case, because the prosecution would eventually argue that Darlie had inflicted the injury herself. The defense would argue that it was evidence that she had actually been attacked. And this is where the case begins to get uncomfortable, because both sides were asking the jury to look at the same wound and reach completely different conclusions. For the prosecution, the wound was part of a staged attack. For the defense, the wound was evidence that Darlie had nearly been killed too. And there was no simple scientific test that could answer this question. There wasn't a machine that could look at the wound and say, an intruder did this, or Darlie did this. Doctors could describe the injury. Experts could discuss the characteristics. But ultimately, the jury had to determine what it meant in the context of everything else. Before we move deeper into the investigation, I want to stop here for a moment. Because sometimes in true crime, the victims can disappear underneath the evidence. They become names in a court document, a bloodstain, a photograph, a statistic. And Devin and Damon deserve more than that. Devin was 6 years old. Damon was 5.
Oh my God, it's so sad.
They were brothers. They were sleeping in their own home, having a sleepover in their living room.
Yeah.
And whatever conclusion you eventually reach about Darlie Routier, that doesn't change the most important fact in this entire story. 2 little boys lost their lives that night. They never got to grow up. They never got to graduate. They never got to become adults. They never got to know the person their younger brother would eventually become. And every argument about this case ultimately comes back to one question. Who took those futures away from them? As investigators began documenting the house, the intruder theory started encountering problems. There was no obvious evidence of traditional burglary. Nothing of obvious value appeared to have been taken, and investigators did not find the kind of clear forced entry they might have expected from an unknown person breaking into an occupied home.
Not to mention, you would think that they would see something like that, given the fact that this was kind of a frenzied attack. You would think that the door would be like kicked in, or there'd be like some,
a struggle, something everywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like you would see that things were all fucked up and, thrown about. And, it just seems frenzied to me.
Right. Agreed. But there was something. A window screen in the garage had been cut. At first glance, that looked significant. If Darlie's story was correct, an intruder could have used that area to enter or leave. But investigators examined the opening and began asking questions. Was it really an entry point? Could someone have climbed through it? Wouldn't that person have left additional evidence? Was the damage consistent with someone breaking in? Or had someone cut the screen from the inside as part of a staged burglary? Those questions would become central to the prosecution's case. And then there was the knife. The knife used in the attack came from inside the Routier home. That fact was not disputed. To prosecutors, this was significant. They argued that an unknown attacker entering the home would be unlikely to choose a weapon from the Routier kitchen and then leave it behind.
Well, truly. I mean, again, to me, it's like, so they break into the house with no plan, and then kill children.
Right. And try to kill the mother.
So what we're learning is that someone broke into the house, started stabbing the kids. The dad only heard when they stabbed the mom and she was screaming, or when she started reacting. Then and somehow missed seeing the person. And then they snuck into the kitchen and had taken the knife and then left the murder weapon at the scene. All of this doesn't really add up. I can understand why they were questioning everything.
100%. The defense didn't have to prove that an intruder absolutely did this. They only had to give jurors a reason to believe it was possible. And an intruder using a kitchen knife isn't impossible. People who commit crimes sometimes use weapons they find at the scene.
Yeah,
so once again, the evidence didn't exist in a vacuum. The question was, what did all of it mean when put together? Then, investigators found something that would become one of the strangest pieces of evidence in the case: a white tube sock. It was discovered in an alley behind the Routier home, and it contained blood from both Devin and Damon. It also became associated with DNA and fiber evidence that investigators believed could connect the sock to the Routier household. The state eventually argued that the sock had been carried outside and deliberately discarded. Why? Because if an intruder had fled the house, leaving something behind outside could make the crime appear more like an escape.
But why would they leave a sock? Why would they take off their sock and leave it on the ground and leave the knife? Yeah, this doesn't add up.
But there was a problem with this theory. If Darlie had staged the crime, she would have had to leave the house and get the sock into the alley. And then she would then have to return and call 911. Supporters of Darlie's innocence have repeatedly argued that the timing made that scenario difficult to accept. The prosecution had a different response. They believed the evidence showed that the sock was part of the staging, and eventually, this seemingly ordinary piece of clothing would become one of the most discussed objects in the entire case.
She could have done that anytime, right? Couldn't she? Like, kids cut themselves all the time or skin a knee or whatever.
Right.
She could have collected the blood on that and then put it in the alley before
she did it.
Yeah.
At some point, investigators stopped asking who broke into the house and started asking, did anyone break into this house at all? That is the moment the case changed, because one investigator began considering Darlie as a perpetrator. Evidence that might previously have been viewed as evidence of an intruder could be interpreted as evidence of staging. The cut screen, staging. The sock, staging. The knife, a weapon taken from inside the house. The lack of theft, evidence there was never even a real burglary. Darlie's injuries, potentially self-inflicted. And the blood evidence, potentially evidence that Darlie had been close to the children when they were attacked. Piece by piece, prosecutors would eventually construct a theory. But there's an important distinction here. A theory isn't the same thing as a fact. The state's theory was that Darlie had killed her sons and then attempted to create an alternate explanation. The defense's theory was that an intruder had attacked the family, and the investigators had interpreted ambiguous evidence through the assumption that Darlie was responsible. And the question would eventually go to a jury. Imagine what was happening to Darlie during all of this. Her sons were dead. Her infant son was still alive. Her husband was supporting her. And investigators were beginning to look at her differently. She had gone from being the mother who survived the attack to being the person police believed might have caused it. And then came the media. Because while detectives were building their case, the public was beginning to build its own. And one particular piece of footage would become almost inseparable from Darlie Routier's name. It showed her at the cemetery, it showed her smiling, and it showed her spraying silly string around her son's grave. For millions of people, that footage became the moment they decided she did it.
I mean, she might just be that everybody grieves differently, that she might just be trying to find some sort of like
there's going to be a little bit more into that. So she gives an explanation. But there was something the television audience didn't see in those short clips. And understanding what happened at that cemetery and what was shown versus what wasn't will become very important later. Because Darlie Routier's trial wouldn't take place in a vacuum. The jury would hear evidence. But long before that jury was sworn in, the public had already begun rendering its verdict. We're going to slow everything down. We're going to look at the evidence one piece at a time, and we're going to hear what the prosecution said it meant, what the defense said it meant, and what later developments have done to our understanding of some of that evidence. Because this is where the case gets complicated, and we're just getting started. Darlie was telling police that an unknown intruder had attacked her family. But within a matter of days, investigators were questioning whether that intruder had ever existed. The prosecutor's case against Darlie Routier wasn't built around one smoking gun. There was no confession, there was no eyewitnesses, and instead the state built a circumstantial case. A case made up of blood, knives, a window screen, a sock, fingerprints, fibers, Darlie's injuries, and her statements. Eventually, the way investigators believed all those pieces fit together. But here's the thing about circumstantial evidence. One piece can look completely different depending on what you believe happened. If there was an intruder, one piece of evidence might make perfect sense. If there wasn't an intruder, that exact same piece might look like staging. And that's what makes this case so fascinating. When investigators began examining the house, they needed to establish something fundamental. How did the killer get inside? Darlie's story was that the unknown man entered the home, but there was no obvious forced entry through the main doors. And there wasn't a broken window that immediately explained how someone had gotten inside. There was, however, damage to a window screen in the garage. The screen had been cut. That seemed potentially significant. If an intruder had entered through the garage, the damaged screen could explain how. But investigators didn't simply stop there. They examined the screen. They looked at the surrounding area. They looked at the evidence inside the garage. And they eventually developed a very different theory. The state argued that the screen had been cut deliberately to make investigators believe an intruder had entered and escaped through that location. And there was a particularly interesting piece of trace evidence. A bread knife from the Routier kitchen was associated with microscopic material from the cut screen. That became significant because the state argued that the knife could have been used to cut the screen. If that was true, it created a major problem for the intruder theory. Because why would an unknown attacker break into the house, then use a knife from the inside of the home?
Well, the point is that he used whatever to break into the screen was the entry point. So that doesn't make sense.
100%. And then he leaves the house, cuts the screen, and then somehow re-enters? That sequence made little sense to prosecutors. They argued the simpler explanation was that the screen had been cut as part of a staged burglary. The defense challenged the state's reconstruction. And that's important because the question wasn't whether the screen had been cut, because it had. The question was who cut it, when, and why. Those are three completely different questions. Then there was the murder weapon, a butcher knife from the Routier home had been used to stab the children. The same weapon was also associated with the injuries to Darlie. The state's theory was that Darlie had obtained the knife from the kitchen and used it to kill her sons. But the defense could point to something obvious. An intruder could also have picked up a knife inside the house. There's nothing physically impossible about that. So, once again, the knife didn't answer the question by itself. It had to be considered alongside everything else. And investigators found something else associated with the knife, a head hair. Testing indicated that the hair was consistent with Darlie Routier. That became relevant enough that the state, before trial, raised concerns about whether Darren's attorney and Darlie's attorney might have a conflict of interest. That is an important detail because it demonstrates just how complicated the investigation had become. At one point, investigators were not only examining Darlie, they were also considering whether Darlie might somehow have been involved. The state's own filing referred to physical evidence that suggested Darlie might have participated in the crime or its cover-up. Ultimately, Darlie was not charged. But that detail matters because it shows that the investigation was not always as simple as police immediately decided Darlie did it. There were other avenues considered. Some went nowhere, and eventually the case focused almost entirely on Darlie. Now let's talk about one of the strangest pieces of evidence, that white tube sock. It was discovered in an alley behind the Routier home, several houses away, and it contained blood from both Devin and Damon. Because if Darlie's story was true, an intruder could have carried the sock out of the house while fleeing. But if prosecutors were right, the sock was part of the staging. And there's another detail that makes the sock even more interesting. Investigators found fibers associated with Darren's sneakers on the sock. The sock has also contained a faint trace of Darlie's DNA. The presence of the children's blood was not disputed. The debate was about what the sock actually meant. The state believed it had been planted. The defense believed it was evidence that an intruder had actually fled the house. And then came the question of timing. How much time would Darlie have had to create the scene? How long would it have taken someone to move from the house to the alley? How much time would she have had to return? How much time passed before the 911 call? These questions would become enormously important because the prosecution's staging theory required a sequence of events, and the defense repeatedly argued that the timeline made that sequence difficult. Years later, when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals considered Darlie's request for additional DNA testing, the court itself acknowledged that the state's theory wasn't impossible to challenge. The court described the case as involving two competing theories, neither of which was perfectly consistent with all of the circumstantial evidence. That's an important observation because it means that even when the court upheld Darlie's conviction, it recognized that the evidence wasn't a perfectly neat puzzle. Now we get to what was arguably the most important forensic evidence at trial: blood. There was a lot of it. 2 children had suffered multiple stab wounds. Darlie had also been seriously injured, and blood was present throughout the area. For prosecutors, the blood evidence helped reconstruct movement. For the defense, the same evidence raised questions about whether investigators could really determine exactly what had happened from stains left behind during such a chaotic attack. One of the most controversial areas was Darlie's nightshirt. Blood from the children was found on it. Darlie's own blood was also present. And a bloodstain pattern expert testified that some of the stains were consistent with what is called cast-off. Cast-off occurs when blood is flung from a blood-covered object as it moves through the air. Think about swinging a wet paintbrush. As the brush moves, droplets can fly outward. The same general principle can occur with a blood-covered weapon. The state's expert, Tom Bevel, testified that stains on Darlie's nightshirt were consistent with cast-off from the stabbing of her sons. That was devastating testimony for the prosecution's case.
Couldn't it be that she was there trying to stop the person and it flung on her?
No.
Okay.
No. Because if Darlie's shirt contained cast-off from the knife and Darlie was wearing the shirt, then prosecutors could argue that she wasn't simply standing nearby. She was actively involved in the attack.
Okay.
But there was an important limitation. Consistent with does not mean proves. And bloodstain pattern can be interpreted. It doesn't automatically come with the label of identifying exactly who created it. And bloodstain pattern analysis has become increasingly scrutinized over the years. That doesn't mean the evidence was worthless. It means the level of certainty attached to conclusions drawn from blood patterns deserves careful consideration. Plus, she claims that she was asleep during their attack, so she wouldn't have been standing over them.
Yeah.
And this Darlie's blood. And then we have the other side of the equation. Darlie's blood was everywhere you would expect it to be if she had actually suffered a serious wound. Her injuries were real. Her neck had been cut deeply. Her arms and hands had injuries. She required medical treatment, so prosecutors faced a problem. They had to explain why someone staging a murder would injure herself so severely. Their answer was that Darlie had intentionally created wounds that looked serious without intending to die. The defense argued that that was absurdly dangerous. They emphasized the location and depth of the neck injury. They argued that someone trying to fake an attack would have no reason to place a knife so close to a major blood vessel.
Unless she felt bad about what she did and she was trying to off herself.
A theory that I don't think anyone has said before.
Oh, well, you heard it here first, guys.
We Aaron with the thoughts. You never know. But I mean, it was this serious that during the trial, Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Vincent DeMaio testified that the slash came within 2 millimeters of the major artery and noted it was not consistent with typical self-inflicted wounds he had observed in his professional experience. Court documents and expert testimony indicated the wound was life-threatening due to the extreme proximity to the artery. And again, there isn't a simple scientific answer. The injury tells us that Darlie was seriously wounded. It doesn't tell us who inflicted it. Another deal investigators examined was the kitchen sink. There was evidence suggesting blood had been washed or diluted there. The prosecution interpreted this as evidence that someone had cleaned the knife. And if someone had washed the knife, that would potentially indicate deliberate staging. Think about the sequence prosecutors were presenting. Darlie kills the boys, she wounds herself, she cleans the knife, she creates the appearance of an intruder. She moves evidence, and then she calls 911.
But why would she clean the knife?
That's what I'm thinking.
Because she tells them that she touched the knife.
Yeah, and that
but she told them in the beginning that she touched the knife. So what's the point in cleaning it?
Well, I think that the point is that she knew she touched it and was on the 911 call. People think it was strange that she mentioned she touched the knife, and they're saying because she knew she touched it and might not have washed.
And she was trying to cover it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
the amount of activity for one person to accomplish in a very short period, while seriously injured and with 2 dying children nearby, was nearly impossible. The defense argued, and that's the larger issue. The prosecution's theory didn't simply require Darlie to murder her children. It required her to commit the murders and then perform a complicated sequence of staging actions. The defense argued that the complexity of that theory should create reasonable doubt. Let's go back to
man. We've seen a lot of cases where people put a lot of time in planning.
A lot of time in planning, 100%. Let's go back to the room where the boys were sleeping. A glass-topped coffee table was present. Investigators found a palm print embedded in dried blood on that table. The print could not be definitively identified. But the state's fingerprint examiner testified that, based on the size of the ridge detail, it appeared to belong to a juvenile, or possibly a child around 5 or 6 years old, because it raised the possibility that the print belonged to Devin or Damon. But it wasn't a definitive identification. It remained an unidentified palm print. And years later, Darlie's attorneys would point to that print as the one reason they believed additional forensic investigation was warranted. The defense position was then that the unidentified print in blood could potentially represent evidence left by someone other than the known members of the household. The state had a much simpler explanation. It was probably one of the children. Again, probably, not definitely. And that's the kind of word that appears over and over in this case. Probably, consistent with, possible, likely. Those words matter because in a case this old, we often hear conclusions presented today as though they were absolute facts. But the actual trial record is more complicated. Then there were hairs, a pubic hair, a facial hair, other microscopic evidence. These were particularly interesting because they potentially offered something that the rest of the evidence didn't. The possibility of identifying someone who didn't belong in the house. At trial, DNA testing was one of the hairs did not produce a usable result. That was in the 1990s. And forensic DNA technology has changed dramatically since then. Years later, Darlie's attorneys argued that newer technology could potentially obtain information from biological material that had produced no result originally. This eventually became part of the litigation over post-conviction DNA testing. And this is where the case gets especially interesting, because in 2008, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals actually ruled that Darlie was entitled to limited additional DNA testing. But, and this is important, it did not mean the court had decided she was innocent. It didn't mean the court had determined an intruder existed. It didn't overturn her conviction, and the court was deciding whether specific pieces of evidence met Texas's legal requirements for additional testing. And the court allowed testing on several categories of biological material, including a previously tested blood stain on the sock that had produced no result, a pubic hair, previously tested blood stains from the nightshirt.
Who drops a pubic hair in a?
Honestly,
I'm just like baffled
I
by
don't
that
know,
part.
but like it's there. A facial hair and certain material from a door leading from the utility room toward the garage. That distinction is incredibly important because DNA testing being allowed is not the same as DNA proving innocence. And there's another part of the 2008 opinion that gets lost in many retellings. The state had already tested multiple bloodstains from the sock. 6 stains were tested. 3 matched Devin, 2 matched Damon, 1 produced no result. The court found that the existing results were not surprising because the sock contained the boys' blood. What interested the defense was the stain that had produced no result and the biological material that might potentially reveal an unknown person. That was where newer testing could potentially matter. The court reasoned that if modern testing identified the blood of an unknown third party on certain evidence, and if that same person's DNA appeared on other items, then that could substantially corroborate Darlie's account. That's a hypothetical scenario. It wasn't a finding that this had happened, but the court acknowledged that such a result could have been powerful enough to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. This is a fascinating piece of legal history because the court essentially said, if the DNA really did connect an unknown person to multiple pieces of evidence at the crime scene, that could matter enormously. The investigators found another detail: life insurance policies on the boys. The policies were reportedly for $5,000 each. The documents were found in a folder in the house.
Much.
No, why would you kill your children for a whopping $10,000?
Yeah, I don't think that that doesn't make sense as like a motive to me.
Absolutely not. The state used that evidence to support its argument that financial circumstances could have been part of the motive. But $5,000 per child is not exactly the kind of life-changing
That's not going to make or break somebody that has has debt. You know what I mean? We see people that you're starting to get into that like $50,000 to $100,000, even $20,000 range. That can make a significant difference, but 10 grand is not necessarily going to make a significant difference to like take the lives of children. I mean, not that that's ever justified. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like that amount seems really odd to me that would be the financial,
I don't
exactly.
think so. That just seems too far-fetched. But there was no evidence that Darlie would have received some enormous financial windfall. This is one of those areas where the prosecutor's theories had to be understood rather than simply repeated. They weren't saying she got rich from the murders. They were arguing that the family's financial circumstances were relevant to motive. The defense rejected the interpretation. So after Devin and Damon's death, family and friends gathered at his grave. It was Devin's birthday. He would have turned 7. There was a memorial. People prayed. People cried. And then at some point, Silly String came out. Darlie participated. She smiled, she laughed, and television cameras recorded it. Those images were broadcast nationally. For many viewers, the footage was horrifying. People couldn't understand how a mother could laugh at her son's grave only days after his murder.
That just doesn't make sense to me, Autumn. I got to be honest. Like, we had a memorial for my dad after he passed. There was lots of moments of storytelling and other things like that, sometimes you have to laugh through the pain, and that's completely normal to me.
I would agree, but this was back in 1996, and
taking pictures at a moment during a service does not, to me, that's not enough evidence for me to go, yep, she's thrilled that her kids are dead.
But this was in 1996, and this was like earth-shattering to people that saw it. They totally convicted her of it.
And as we know, like when I did Lorena or lots of cases that you've done, in the 90s, it was that like tabloid craze that everyone was just taking moments and making it a huge deal.
Right. And it wasn't. Like, to me, that was completely normal because it was his fucking birthday.
Yeah, and
How,
someone could be sharing a moment, a story or something to find the, joy of a moment when he was alive.
she was laughing while she was spraying the silly string, and so people clipped that and
Well,
said,
but
"Look at her."
wasn't their silly string brought out by other people as well?
But they caught her doing it.
Exactly. So this was just a moment that they took from something that was horrific, and she probably was crying the rest of it. You know what I mean?
We only have some short clips,
Yeah,
but
it's
the
just
complete context was more complicated than the short television clips suggested.
sure.
And the question of Darlie's behavior would eventually become a major part of the prosecution's narrative, because prosecutors weren't just asking jurors to believe Darlie had staged a crime scene. They were asking them to look at her behavior afterward and conclude that it was consistent with someone who had killed her children,
I mean, the
which
truth
is
of the matter
insane.
is the truth of the matter is if you were a prosecutor, you would immediately jump on that too.
Of course.
So that makes sense to me. The tabloids jumping on it totally makes sense for me, especially in the 90s.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, it was
but
everywhere.
do I think that condemns
That
her? No.
absolutely not. I don't agree with that either. The defense had a different interpretation. They argued that grief isn't a performance with one universally correct script. People react to trauma differently. Some cry, some become numb, some laugh at inappropriate moments, some behave almost normally. Some don't know how to behave at all. But why would 12 jurors see it that way? We already know the answer. They didn't. By the time Darlie Routier's trial began, the prosecution had assembled a complicated circumstantial case, and the defense had complicated explanations for almost every piece of it. The jury would now have to decide which explanation made more sense. Was it the mother who had murdered her children and staged an elaborate crime scene? Or was this a woman who survived an attack by an unknown intruder and then became the focus of an investigation because investigators couldn't make sense of what they found? The public had already seen Darlie smiling at her son's grave. For some people, that image was enough. For others, it was irrelevant. But the jury wasn't asked to decide whether Darlie's behavior made them uncomfortable. They were being asked to decide whether the state had proved capital murder beyond a reasonable doubt. And in January 1997, they would hear all of it. The blood, the sock, the knife, the screen, the fingerprints, the medical evidence, the financial evidence, and the story Darlie had been telling since the night her sons died. The defense's response, the testimony, the infamous cemetery footage, the verdict, and the death sentence. They were all going to leave the 1990s behind and follow what happened afterward, including long legal fight over DNA testing and what the courts actually said about the possibility of evidence from an unknown intruder. Because the trial may have ended with a guilty verdict, but the argument over what happened inside that house never really ended. Darlie Routier was arrested on June 18, 1996. She was charged with the capital murder and the deaths of her 5-year-old son, Damon. And she was also charged in connection with Devin's death, but the state ultimately tried her for Damon's murder. That distinction is important. Darlie was convicted of murdering Damon. She was not convicted of Devin's murder because she was never tried for that killing. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals later affirmed her conviction and death sentence. And that means when we talk about Darlie Routier today, the legal status is very specific. She is a woman convicted and sentenced to death for killing Damon Routier. The murder of Devin was part of the same criminal episode, but there was never a separate trial resulting in a conviction for Devin's death. Darlie's trial began January 1997. The state's case was circumstantial. That word is important. There wasn't a witness who testified. There wasn't a confession. Instead, prosecutors were asking jury to take dozens of individual facts and put them together. And those facts created a consistent picture. They wanted the jury to conclude that Darlie was the killer. The defense had another job. They didn't necessarily have to explain every single piece of evidence perfectly. They needed to create reasonable doubt. They needed juries to believe that an intruder was at least a reasonable possibility. and they decided to convince jurors that the state's staging theory wasn't as certain as prosecutors' claims. After hearing the evidence, the jury deliberated, and then they reached their decision. On February 4th, 1997, Darlie Routier was found guilty of capital murder in Damon's death. She was 27 years old. The next day, the jury sentenced her to death. And with that, the trial was over. But the case wasn't, not even close.
What did her husband do at this point? Was he still standing by her side?
Stood by her and still to this day stands by her.
Wow, okay.
Darlie was sent to the women's death row in Texas. She has remained incarcerated ever since. Her conviction was automatically appealed because Texas death sentences received direct review by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. And in 2003, that court affirmed the conviction and sentence. The court rejected 14 points of error raised by Darlie's attorneys. That meant the original conviction remained intact. But Darlie's legal team continued pursuing post-conviction relief. Additional testing has continued over the years and is still happening. In 2019, NBC5 reported that another round of DNA testing was underway, involving evidence that had not previously been identified as belonging to Darlie or either of her sons. Her attorney described several areas of potential interest, while acknowledging that testing had not yet produced the definitive evidence of an intruder the defense was looking for. In 2021, a Dallas County judge signed an order directing multiple agencies to send evidence for additional forensic testing. Recent reporting indicates that testing process has continued, but publicly released results have not produced an exoneration or overturned the conviction.
It makes sense to me with technology changing that they keep testing.
And I'm glad they are. I mean, I feel like everyone, especially on death row, deserves that.
Sure.
And as of 2026, Darlie Routier remains on death row. There is no execution date. Her conviction and death sentence remain in place, and she continues to maintain she did not kill her children. There are people who have spent years studying this case who believe Darlie is innocent. Their argument genuinely centers around several things. They question the staging theory. But Darlie herself has never abandoned her account of an intruder. Darlie's former husband, Darren, has also publicly maintained that he does not believe Darlie killed their children. The couple did later divorce. And I feel like that's because, I mean, this happened in 1996 and she's still on death row. You can't really have
for sure.
a relationship.
At some point, you need to move on with your life. And also their other child, could, I'm sure, use a mother.
100%. I
don't know.
Saying that she's replaceable, but...
No, I'm not saying she's replaceable, but I'm just saying that, it might be whether that is what happened or not, I think that having someone else to help guide them.
I agree, 100%. For me, the most difficult part of this case isn't the silly string, it isn't the sock, it isn't even the blood evidence. It's the two little boys at the center of everything. Devin was 6, Damon was 5. They had a little brother who was only 7 months old. And on June 6th, 1996, their lives ended inside their own home. Whatever happened that night, someone knows. Someone knows what happened in those final moments. And if Darlie is telling the truth, then somewhere there's a person who murdered 2 little boys and never has been held accountable. If the state is right, then the person responsible has been identified, convicted, and sitting on the row for nearly 3 decades. Those are 2 completely different realities, and only one can be true. 30 years later, Darlie Routier remains one of the most debated women in American true crime. She has become a symbol to different people of completely different things. To some, she's an example of a mother who murdered her children and manipulated the public with a false story. To others, she's an example of how investigators can become committed to one theory and then interpret ambiguous evidence through that theory. And so the others, she's a reminder that our assumptions about how a grieving mother should behave can be incredibly powerful. Because imagine if there had been no cemetery footage, no silly string, no television cameras. Would people view the case differently? Maybe. Would the evidence change? No. And that's why I think it's important to separate the emotional evidence from the physical evidence. A woman laughing doesn't prove murder. A woman crying doesn't prove innocence. A mother behaving differently than we expect doesn't tell us what happened in a dark room hours earlier. Evidence has to do that. As of 2026, Darlie Routier remains on Texas death row. She has no execution date, her conviction has not been overturned, and the additional forensic testing and legal proceedings have not resulted in a public finding that clears her. And the state continues to stand behind the original conviction. At the same time, her defense continues to pursue avenues for additional forensic examination and legal review. So this case isn't nearly finished, even though the trial ended. Devin Routier was 6 years old, Damon Routier was 5, and they deserved to grow up. That's the part of this case that should never become lost. If this case made you question what you thought you knew, you're not alone. And if you have an opinion about what happened, I would encourage you to do what we're always doing here. Don't just listen to the headline. Look at the evidence. Look at what the court actually said. Look at what it's proven. And look at what it's disputed. And then make up your mind. My sources were the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, Routier versus the state, the U.S. Supreme Court, Darlie Lynn Routier versus Texas, Unsolved Mysteries, Dateline, and ABC News.
Well, since I am a first-time hearing of this case, really, I'm sure if I saw a picture, I'd be like, oh, I remember that, but not that I knew anything about the case, just that I remember it in the media.
Right.
I just
probably seen the silly string because it was everywhere.
I'm sure I had. Yeah. I don't think that you can condemn somebody for that. And I think I've made that pretty clear. I just don't know, though. It seems very odd to me that people do crazy shit all the time, right? That somebody broke into a house and then stabbed the children, and kids are loud. If one was getting stabbed, the other would have screamed. She wouldn't have been sleeping through that. So that to me doesn't really add up. Granted, I'm not in that situation, so I can't say how someone would react. But I would imagine that the kid would be loud and then the other one would be loud as well. So
that's the part that I just can't wrap my head around. Like, she stated that she didn't wake up until she was like kind of in and out of it. And then she realized, and she thinks because of the loss of blood that she was cut in the neck, that it was because of that's why she was having a hard time. But I mean why
that
would this
sounds
intruder
plausible.
come in and then, you know what I mean? Like, the intruder comes in, then kills these kids.
But has to search the kitchen first for the weapon.
Right. And then has to break in somehow. I mean, the whole thing is just...
Then go down the block and leave a sock.
So weird,
that somehow has evidence that it may have been... It sounds like it was her husband's sock, to be honest.
Right. That's what I'm assuming, too, especially since they found his DNA. It's just so wild.
So a sock from your house, why would they have that and leave it and not take the knife? All of this doesn't really add up, you know, and not having definitive proof fucking sucks, because then you can't say for sure. But I gotta be honest, to me, the evidence that they do have I'm leaning more towards seeing that she's guilty.
100%.
You know,
at first, I was questioning it because her severity of her wound on her neck was so bad.
I still stand by what I said, that she may have tried to, kill herself.
I haven't seen that. And that's actually really a good theory that you put out there, because that is entirely possible.
I mean, that could attest why it was so deep. And then all of a sudden she freaked out and was like, no, I don't want to do that, and screams for her husband.
Right.
So to me, that seems like also possibly plausible, especially when we know that she had postpartum depression, not saying that that leads people to kill their children, but,
Right.
it could contribute to her mental state at the
And
time.
I wrote this before the Lindsay Clancy case started too. And then I was just like watching the Lindsay Clancy case and thinking of this case. And it's right. Like, just because you have postpartum depression doesn't mean you're going to murder your children. But
No.
it definitely raises a red flag in essence that she was having that, and then her children were murdered.
Yeah, I mean, it can contribute to someone's mental state. So there's other contributing factors, right? It's not just that reason. So I'm just saying, if she was already in this state, she's feeling overwhelmed. I don't think the financial side of it is really anything, but if she's feeling overwhelmed and all of this, with just her home life and it all feeling very overwhelming and the walls closing in around her, and then, plans this out or whatever. Because to me, it would make sense that it was planned. If they find evidence on a butter knife that the window was or the screen was cut, that to me tells me this was premeditated. The sock being left a while, down the way with the evidence, again, premeditated. I feel like this wasn't something that happened in a moment. I think that this was planned. And in my opinion, I think it leads me to believe that she would be guilty of this crime.
I know. I'm on the same page as you. And I think that maybe her husband can't see that she did this because you can't
I
see
wouldn't
that
want
someone
to.
you love would
Yeah,
be
I wouldn't
capable
want
of
to.
doing something so horrific. But
I
I
absolutely
don't
would not
think
wanna know
that
that.
I do not think her motivation was the life insurance policies. I truly
No.
don't.
No.
I think there was something else going on, but I do not think that it was the motivation with the
So
financial payouts.
$10,000 for anybody could
No,
definitely
especially
enhance
since her
somebody's
husband
life.
owned a business. And
Yeah.
yes, they had a lot of debt, but he was doing very well for a really
And
long
that's not
time.
10 grand is not gonna make or break debt. It's just
No,
not.
not
There's a lot
enough
of
to
people
kill your
out here
children.
sitting with a lot more than 10 grand in credit cards right now. You know what I mean? Like, that
Absolutely.
just doesn't that to me is not a motive.
I'm on the same
Being
page.
overwhelmed by her life and her own mental state, yeah, that could absolutely be her motive.
Right,
But
but
not the
not the
financial side of it.
financial. No,
That's grabbing at straws to me
I would agree.
for that. But I mean, I hope they keep retesting everything, and I hope
And I
that
hope
they
they
find
finally
an
get like
answer.
a solid answer for sure.
For everyone's sake, for their
Yes.
surviving child,
For their
her
surviving
husband,
child. For
it's
her
important,
family. Her mom still supports her. Like, for everyone involved.
and currently she's the only one that knows the truth. Unless there's also a vigilante or not vigilante, there's also this intruder,
An intruder.
that's out there. So I just, yeah, nothing about this case tells me any different. I would side with what the jury chose, to be
I would
honest.
too.
I don't think the silly string thing, that to me is not, that is irrelevant to the case to me.
I agree.
But also, this is the same stuff that they did with Lorena Bobbitt, the same stuff that they did with so many cases where they took a clip, a picture, and put it on tabloids and spread it everywhere, which also makes it super difficult to to bring in a jury that really would not know about it. That's not going to happen. So when the public
100%.
already makes, I mean, we see it in my old cases too, when the public already makes a decision about what they think, then it becomes difficult to be objective. But it was to prove, did they believe that she did this crime, that they have enough evidence to convict her of that crime? And they did. And I would have to side with them. I wish there was like definitive. I want, me, I want everything in its box. I want to see that I know all the answers, and it's unfortunate that we don't yet. But I
Right.
feel like with modern DNA testing, we may have that information, and I could be completely wrong. We could find DNA from an intruder. I don't know. But
We just don't know. But I'm leaning towards that it was her.
yeah. Yeah, and then she just convinced herself. But I still stick to my theory. I think she did. She was like upset. I mean, we see that a lot with parents who have attempted to kill their children or kill their children, they also tend to turn the violence on themselves. So, I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case and then she, didn't put it deep enough because she was regretting her decisions. So, I don't know. The only person that knows is her.
It's
And
her.
hopefully at some point we will get an answer on what actually happened. I'm
Mhm.
glad you covered this case. And again, we will be back next week with new episodes always out on Tuesday. And next week we will both have cases for you. I will be on the mend and back to normal, weird as ever. And follow us on Instagram at Murder Not Murdering. Slide into those DMs if you got some old timey crimies for me that you'd love me to cover. We also have a subreddit that you can follow, and we're on TikTok. Man, we're everywhere. Find us.
Everywhere.
And thank you so much for listening to us. We appreciate all of you. We couldn't do this without you. So thanks again for listening, and we'll be back next week. Bye.
Bye.